But we will focus in one of the important sources of information, which is the communication with the predecessor auditor. So because this predecessor auditor is rich with information about our prospective client. So that is why we make it a point to communicate with them before we accept our prospective client. So take note of the guidelines when we communicate with the predecessor auditor. So it is the successor auditor or the incoming auditor who is or who has the burden of initiating communication with the predecessor or previous auditor. It's not the other way around. So you will not wait for the previous auditor to approach you as an incoming auditor. So it is the incoming auditor who should approach the previous auditor. So the successor auditor or the incoming auditor should request permission. So this is very important of the prospective client before contacting the predecessor auditor. So meaning to say, while it is required for us to contact with the predecessor auditor, it should be compliant with the relevant ethical requirements, so such as the requirement on confidentiality. So because the predecessor or previous auditor cannot just divulge information to you as an incoming auditor without the consent of the prospective client. So you have to obtain in writing the consent of the prospective client before you contact or communicate with the predecessor auditor. So let's say you have obtained consent in writing of the prospective client. So what are the matters that you will ask from the previous auditor? So usually, we inquire matters related to the following. Number one, so facts that might bear on the integrity of the client. Number two, disagreements with management regarding accounting policies, audit procedures, or significant matters. Communication with audit committee. For example, the previous auditor has communicated certain deficiencies to the audit committee, fraud, illegal acts. So those are the matters that we have also to ask from the predecessor auditor. And finally, I mentioned this earlier already, the reasons for the change in auditors. Okay, so what is the reason or what are the reasons why, for example, the previous client changed their auditors? Now, on the part of the predecessor auditor, how would you respond? As previous auditor, you have to respond fully and honestly to the request of the incoming or successor auditor. So, if your response is limited or restricted, so you have to communicate also that fact to the incoming auditor. For example, you were restricted by the client to communicate certain information to the incoming auditor. Such should also be mentioned to the successor auditor. Now finally, if the prospective client refused to grant consent to the incoming auditor or refused consent to the previous auditor to communicate with the successor auditor, then the successor auditor or incoming auditor should consider the reasons for the refusal of the prospective client. But take note, guys, that it doesn't necessarily mean that if the prospective client did not allow the previous auditor to communicate with you, it's not automatic that you will have to decline the audit engagement. So you have to consider the reason first why the prospective client did not give consent to the previous auditor. And after weighing the reasons, then you will decide whether to accept or to decline the audit engagement. So let us summarize the steps in communicating with predecessor auditor. So again, the first step is to obtain permission or consent from the client or prospective client before approaching the predecessor auditor. So because on the part of the predecessor auditor, he or she is bound by this fundamental principle of confidentiality. He or she just can't provide information about his or her client to third party, so which is here the successor auditor. So one of the outcome of this step is that the client agrees. So if the client agrees, the prospective client gave his or her consent or permission, then we provide our request of information to the predecessor auditor, who will then accept our request for information. So on the part of the predecessor auditor can provide the information asked by the successor auditor. So remember those information that we asked from predecessor auditor. So we have information about integrity of the management, disagreement with management regarding accounting policies or auditing procedures. We have communication with audit committee. And finally, we have reasons for change of auditors. And then the successor auditor should consider that information in deciding whether to accept or to decline the audit engagement. Okay? Now, another possibility is that the predecessor auditor will provide limited or restricted information. Okay? So, if the successor auditor receives limited or restricted information from the predecessor auditor, the successor auditor should consider the reasons why the predecessor auditor provided limited or restricted information. And in that case, since we haven't obtained the information that we need, we have to obtain information from other sources. And after we have obtained information from other sources, we consider that information to decide whether to accept or decline the engagement. So finally, let's go back to the top. It's also possible that the client would not provide information, consent or permission for us to contact the predecessor auditor. If the client refuses to provide consent or permission, then we cannot contact the predecessor auditor. Do we immediately decline the engagement? Not necessarily. We have to consider first the reason why the client did not give his or her permission or consent. Okay, and then after considering the reason, then we have to obtain information from other sources. And after obtaining information from other sources, we consider the information that we have obtained to decide whether to accept or decline the audit engagement. Next part, we will discuss evaluation of continuing client rather. So meaning to say, we are not only required to evaluate first-time clients. We have to also continually evaluate our recurring engagements or our recurring client. In evaluating continuing clients, we have to consider significant matters that have arisen during the current or even previous audits and determine their implication to the continuing relationship. Some of the factors that we have to consider in evaluating continuous relationship or continuing our current relationship with the client are as follows. First, we have expiration of a time period. For example, you've been auditing this client for some years already, and there is this standard or requirement that you can only audit the client for a fixed amount or X number of years. Like for example, in case of listed clients. So you have to consider that in evaluating whether you will accept the client for as audit engagement client for the succeeding period or succeeding year. You also have to consider major changes in the client's management, business, ownership, legal advisors, even financial condition, litigation, scope of engagement, and even the nature of our client's business. So for example, the client has shifted into a different type of nature of business for which we do not have the necessary competence. Then you have to consider whether you can still accept the client as a continuing client despite that change. And finally, you also consider the existence of conditions that would have caused the firm not to reject the client if those conditions existed at the time of your initial acceptance. So, for example, information has come to light only in the latter years of you auditing the client that had you known that information in the past, you would have rejected that client at that time. So you have to consider that in continuing the client as your audit engagement client in your future audits.